March 25, 2005. The Los Angeles Clippers waived Kenny Anderson. No press conference, no farewell ceremony, just a phone call, and it was over. He was 34 years old, 14 years in the league, $63 million in career earnings. Gone. That same spring, his mother died. A few months later, he filed for bankruptcy. The same year he retired. On the surface, this looks like another cautionary tale about an athlete who made too much and spent it faster. But underneath is something far more uncomfortable. This is the story of a child the entire system, the scouts, the coaches, the franchises, consumed whole, extracted everything they needed, and then discarded. And not one person along the way stopped to ask, who is Kenny Anderson when the ball isn't in his hands? To understand how Kenny Anderson lost everything, you first have to understand where Kenny Anderson came from. Lefrak City, Queens, New York. 15 high-rise apartment buildings packed into 40 acres on the border of Corona and Elmhurst. Over 5,000 units. Tens of thousands of people stacked on top of each other, living paycheck to paycheck, trying to keep their kids off the street and out of trouble. In the 1970s and 80s, Lefrak City wasn't the worst place in New York, but it wasn't far from it. This is where Kenny grew up, in a small apartment with his mother Joan and his two sisters. Joan Anderson was a single mother raising 3 kids in a neighborhood that didn't give you much room for error. By all accounts, she was fierce, loving, and completely devoted to her children. When Kenny was still an infant, she gave him a nickname, Chibs. A baby name, a term of endearment. But as Kenny got older, as the trophies started piling up and the attention started rolling in, Joan would shift the nickname slightly. When she thought her son was getting too big for his britches, too caught up in the praise, too convinced of his own myth, she would look at him and say, Mr. Chibs. 2 words that meant, don't forget who you are. He would spend the rest of his life trying to figure out what those 2 words actually meant. The basketball found Kenny before Kenny found basketball. College recruiters began scouting him in the 6th grade. Not high school. 6th grade. He was 12 years old, playing pickup games in the parking lots and courts of Lefrak City. And grown men with clipboards were already writing his name down. By the time he was 14, he was on the front page of the New York City sports section. By the time he enrolled at Archbishop Malloy High School in Briarwood, Queens, the expectations were already suffocating. And somehow, he exceeded every single one of them. 4 years, 4 consecutive all-city selections, a feat that hadn't been accomplished since Lou Alcindor, the teenager, who would later become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kenny was a McDonald's All-American, New York State Mr. Basketball, the best point guard the city had seen in a generation. They called him the next Magic Johnson. He was 17 years old. Here's what people don't talk about when they tell that story. When the entire city decides a child is a prodigy when scouts show up before puberty, when newspaper photographers follow you to practice, when every adult in your world defines you by what you can do with a basketball, something else happens quietly. The child never gets to figure out who he is without the ball. Every question Kenny Anderson was ever asked was about basketball. Every relationship he formed was mediated through basketball. Every door that opened for him opened because of basketball. His value, from the time he was 12 years old, was entirely athletic. That loyalty, that complete surrender of identity to the game would eventually cost him everything. But first, it would take him to Georgia Tech, where he became one of the most electrifying college players in the country. He led the Yellow Jackets to the Final Four in 1990. By his sophomore year, he was averaging nearly 26 points per game. The NBA came calling, and nobody, not his coaches, not the scouts, not the university, told him to wait. He declared for the 1991 NBA draft after just 2 years. He had 2 years of eligibility left. He was 20 years old. The system had everything it needed from Kenny Anderson, and Kenny Anderson stepped forward and gave it willingly, because nobody had ever taught him there was another option. June 26, 1991, the NBA Draft. With the first pick, the Charlotte Hornets selected Larry Johnson. With the second pick, the New Jersey Nets selected Kenny Anderson. He was 20 years old, the youngest player in the entire league, and he was walking into one of the most pressure-filled situations a young point guard could inherit: a struggling franchise in a mediocre arena across the Hudson River, desperate for a savior, telling their fan base they had just found one. The Nets didn't just want a good player. They wanted the high school version of Kenny Anderson, the kid from the front page, the next Magic Johnson, the one who made Lefrak City proud. That version of Kenny Anderson existed in highlight reels and newspaper headlines. The 20-year-old who actually showed up to training camp was still figuring out how to be a professional. His rookie year was difficult. 7 points per game, adjustment struggles, a franchise that needed him to be more than he was ready to be. The city was patient, but barely. Then, in year 2, something clicked. He nearly doubled his scoring average. The Nets made the playoffs. The promise was real. And then came year 3. 18.8 points per game, 9.6 assists per game. An all-star selection alongside Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley. On February 18, 1994, he dropped 42 points and 12 assists against the Washington Bullets. 2 months later, 45 points and 14 assists against Detroit, a career high that still stands. For one shining season, Kenny Anderson was exactly what everyone said he would be. But here's what people forget about that 1993-94 New Jersey Nets team. They were supposed to be a dynasty. Kenny Anderson at point guard, Derek Coleman the first overall pick from 1990 at power forward, and Drazen Petrovic, the Croatian shooting guard who was quietly becoming one of the most lethal scorers in the entire league. 3 young stars. A big 3 before the term existed. Then, on June 7, 1993, before Kenny's All-Star season even began, Petrovic was killed in a car accident on a highway outside Munich, Germany. He was 28 years old. Just like that, the dynasty was gone. Kenny Anderson never spoke extensively about what Petrovic's death did to him. But consider this. He was 22 years old, playing alongside a teammate he admired, building something real, and then in an instant, that person was simply no longer alive. One of the first lessons the NBA taught Kenny Anderson was this: everything you build can disappear without warning. That lesson would take on a haunting significance later. After the All-Star season, the money arrived. And when the money arrived in full, the contracts, the endorsements, the checks with more zeros than anything a kid from Lefrak City had ever seen, Kenny Anderson did what almost any 22-year-old from his background would have done. He spent it. Not recklessly in the way people imagine when they hear broke athlete. Not on one catastrophic investment or one catastrophic night. He spent it the way someone spends money when they have never had it, never been taught how to manage it, and are surrounded entirely by people who need it. 20 cars. At one point, Kenny Anderson owned 11 cars simultaneously. He would later explain it simply: the more money, the more bills. But the bills weren't just cars and clothes. The bills were people. Queens never let you forget where you came from, and Kenny Anderson never tried to forget. He brought people with him. He took care of people. He said yes when he should have said no, because in the world he grew up in, saying no to someone who needed help wasn't strength, it was betrayal. And in the midst of all this, the spending, the entourage, the obligations, his personal life was expanding just as fast as his paycheck. A daughter with Dee Roper, better known as DJ Spinderella of Salt and Peppa. A marriage to Tammy Roman, who would later appear on the reality series Basketball Wives. More children, more relationships, more financial obligations quietly multiplying in the background. By his mid-20s, Kenny Anderson was already supporting a small city on an NBA salary. In the NBA itself? The coaches? The front offices? The agents? Not one of them sat him down and walked him through what this would look like in 10 years. Because that wasn't their job. Their job was to win basketball games. After the All-Star season, Kenny Anderson never quite became what everyone expected. Not because the talent disappeared. Watch the tape. The handles, the court vision, the ability to create offense out of nothing. It was all still there. But superstardom requires more than talent. It requires a singular focus, a stable environment, and a franchise willing to build around you for years. Kenny Anderson would never have any of those things again. In February 1996, the Nets traded him to the Charlotte Hornets. Just like that. 4.5 seasons, 1 All-Star game, a career high of 45 points, and the organization moved on. He averaged 15.2 points for Charlotte in 38 games. That summer, he signed with the Portland Trail Blazers, then Boston, then Indiana, then Seattle, then New Orleans, then Atlanta, then Los Angeles. 9 teams in 14 years. If you're counting, that's a new city, a new coaching staff, a new system, and a new set of teammates roughly every 18 months. Most people read that as a basketball story. A talented player who never quite lived up to his draft position, bouncing around the league as his skills declined. But here's what that statistic actually means off the court. Every time Kenny Anderson was traded or signed elsewhere, he had to uproot his life and relocate. New apartment, new city, new everything. But his financial obligations didn't relocate with him. They stayed exactly where they were and grew. Let's talk about the numbers honestly. By his late 20s, Kenny Anderson had 7 children with 4 different women, 3 marriages, multiple alimony agreements, multiple child support arrangements. Now, and this is important, this video isn't here to judge those choices, but we do need to understand what they meant financially, because the math is brutal regardless of the circumstances. Child support payments are calculated as a percentage of income. When your income is an NBA salary, those percentages translate into significant monthly obligations. Multiply that across 7 children and 3 ex-wives, spread across different states, governed by different court orders, and you have a financial structure that demands a consistent, large income just to stay current. And here's the problem. NBA careers don't stay consistent. They decline. The contracts get smaller. The roster spots get harder to hold. The years of maximum salary don't last forever, and when they end, the obligations don't end with them. Kenny Anderson knew this was coming. He would later say it plainly. "I thought the money would last, and I didn't know how to say no." That sentence contains 2 separate problems. The first is financial illiteracy, a genuine belief that $63 million was an inexhaustible supply rather than a finite resource with an expiration date. The second is something deeper, the inability to say no, to family, to friends, to the obligations that came with being Kenny Anderson from Lefrak City. Both of those problems have the same root cause. Nobody ever taught him otherwise. Here's what the NBA offered rookie players in terms of financial education in the early 1990s. Not much. There was no mandatory financial literacy program, no structured guidance on long-term planning, no intervention system for players showing early signs of financial distress. The league provided a paycheck and a union, and beyond that, players were largely on their own. The agents took their percentage. The financial advisors, where they existed, often had more interest in commissions than in genuinely protecting their clients. The coaches were focused on wins. The front offices were focused on cap space. Everyone in Kenny Anderson's professional life had an incentive to keep him playing basketball. Nobody had an incentive to make sure he'd be okay when he stopped. Off the court, the warning signs were becoming harder to ignore. Multiple DUI arrests punctuated his career. Exact details across the full timeline are difficult to confirm from public records, but what is documented is that by the time he was coaching high school basketball in Florida years later, a 2013 DUI conviction cost him that job entirely. The drinking wasn't random. It was connected to something that Kenny Anderson wouldn't be able to articulate publicly for years. A pain he had been carrying since childhood, buried under basketball trophies and contract negotiations, and the permanent performance of being Mr. Chibbs. We'll come back to that. By 2003, the contracts were shrinking to the minimum. By 2004, the Atlanta Hawks signed him and waived him within months. The Los Angeles Clippers picked him up off waivers in February 2005. They waived him 5 weeks later. His last professional contract was in Lithuania, with Žalgiris Kaunas. 1 season. Then that ended too. The machine that had found Kenny Anderson in the 6th grade, that had put him on the front page at 14, that had made him the second pick in the draft at 20, that machine had finished with him. But here's what nobody was paying attention to during those final years of roster moves and minimum contracts. The financial damage wasn't happening in one dramatic moment. It was happening slowly, quietly, in the accumulated weight of obligations that had never been properly managed, compounding across a decade, on a salary that was getting smaller every year. The collapse wasn't coming. It had already been happening for years. There is a particular kind of ending that comes without fanfare. No final game where the crowd rises to its feet. No ceremony at center court. No jersey retirement. No standing ovation. No moment where the arena holds its breath and acknowledges what it witnessed. Just a phone call. March 25, 2005. The Los Angeles Clippers informed Kenny Anderson that he had been waived. He had played for them for less than 4 weeks. Before that, Atlanta had waived him. Before that, Indiana had let him go. Before that, Seattle had traded him away. He was 34 years old, and the NBA was done with him. He packed his things and went to Lithuania. Not as a victory lap, not as a farewell tour, as a man trying to hold on to the only identity he had ever known, in a country where nobody had heard of Lefrak City or Archbishop Malloy or the 1994 All-Star Game. 1 season with Žalgiris Kaunas, then that door closed too. Kenny Anderson's professional basketball career was over, and he came home to discover that the financial infrastructure of his entire adult life had been quietly collapsing for years. Let's put the number on the table clearly. $63 million. That is the total career earnings of Kenny Anderson across 14 seasons in the NBA. For context, $63 million, managed conservatively, generates enough annual interest to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes without ever touching the principal. By 2005, it was gone. Not most of it, not a significant portion. Gone. How does that happen? Not through one catastrophic decision, no single bad investment, no one catastrophic night. It happened the way most financial collapses happen. Slowly, then all at once, through 1,000 smaller decisions that each seemed manageable in isolation. The 11 cars, the entourage, the lifestyle that a kid from Lefrak City had earned and refused to apologize for. The child support. 7 children across multiple households, each with court-mandated payments calculated during the years of maximum salary payments that didn't shrink when the contracts did. The alimony from 3 marriages. The yes, every time someone who needed help came to him asking. And underneath all of it, the financial advisors who weren't advising. The agents who had moved on to newer clients. The league that had provided a paycheck, but never a blueprint. When Kenny Anderson filed for bankruptcy in 2005, he didn't do it as someone who had been reckless with money in the way the tabloids would later imply. He did it as someone who had been failed at every structural level by an industry that profits enormously from young athletes and invests almost nothing in preparing them for the life that comes after. He would later say it himself, without bitterness, without deflection. "I thought the money would last, and I didn't know how to say no." That is not the statement of a man making excuses. That is the statement of a man who was never taught. But 2005 wasn't just the year the money ran out. 2005 was the year Kenny Anderson lost his mother. Joan Anderson, the woman who raised 3 children alone in Lefrak City, who worked to keep her family together in a neighborhood that didn't make that easy, who had been there for every step of her son's improbable journey from Queens housing projects to NBA arenas, passed away that year. She was the person who called him Chibs when he was a baby. The person who called him Mr. Chibs when he needed to be brought back down to earth. The only constant in a life that had been defined by movement, city to city, team to team, contract to contract. She was gone. Kenny Anderson lost his career and his mother in the same calendar year, then filed for bankruptcy in that same stretch of months. 3 punches. No recovery time between them. Now, there is a part of this story that Kenny Anderson didn't speak publicly about for nearly 8 years after the bankruptcy. A part that, when he finally did share it, reframed everything that came before. In 2013, Kenny Anderson revealed that he had been sexually abused as a child by a person in his neighborhood and by a basketball coach. He said it plainly, without dramatization, in interviews connected to his documentary. "I was living with too much hurt in me." He also said something that stopped me when I read it. "If my mother were still living, I don't know if I would have done it and came out." Let that sit for a moment. This is a man who carried that weight, that specific, devastating weight from childhood through a 14-year NBA career, through 3 marriages, through bankruptcy, through the death of his mother. He carried it while playing in front of 20,000 people. He carried it while signing contracts and giving interviews and performing the role of Mr. Chibs for a city that had decided who he was before he was old enough to decide for himself. And nobody knew. Because in the world Kenny Anderson grew up in Lefrak City in the 1980s, in the hyper-masculine culture of professional basketball, you didn't talk about that. You didn't ask for help. You performed strength, because strength was the only currency that mattered. You said yes to everyone who needed you, because saying yes was the one thing that made you feel in control. You spent money on people who depended on you, because being needed was the closest thing to being loved that the situation allowed. You drank, sometimes, because the alternative was sitting alone with what you were carrying. This is the part of Kenny Anderson's story that the broke athlete narrative completely misses. The financial collapse wasn't the disease. It was a symptom. Underneath the 11 cars and the child support payments and the bankruptcy filing was a man who had been carrying unprocessed trauma since childhood. Trauma that had never been acknowledged, never been treated, never been given space to exist, because from the moment the scouts showed up in 6th grade, the only thing anyone ever needed from Kenny Anderson was his basketball. The system that found him, celebrated him, and ultimately discarded him, never once asked about the rest. Let's break down who failed Kenny Anderson. The industry that recruited him as a child took a 12-year-old boy from a difficult home environment, placed the weight of an entire city's expectations on his shoulders, and provided zero psychological support for what that pressure does to a developing human being. The league he played in offered him a paycheck and a union card, but no mandatory financial education, no mental health infrastructure, and no transition program for the moment the career ended. The people around him, some genuinely caring, some simply opportunistic, benefited from his generosity without ever telling him the truth about where it was heading. Everyone had an incentive to keep Kenny Anderson feeling like Mr. Chibs. Nobody had an incentive to tell him that the money was running out. And the culture itself. The culture that tells young black men from poor neighborhoods that strength means silence. That asking for help is weakness. That your value is entirely tied to what you can perform. That culture made it nearly impossible for Kenny Anderson to raise his hand and say, "I am not okay. I need help. Something happened to me and I have never dealt with it." By the end of 2005, Kenny Anderson had lost his career, his mother, and his financial stability. What he still had, what nobody could take, was the truth he hadn't told yet. And eventually, that truth would become the foundation of the only rebuild that actually mattered. Here is something the cautionary tale version of the story never tells you. After the bankruptcy, after the mother's death, after Lithuania, after the career ended without ceremony in a country 6,000 miles from Queens, Kenny Anderson got up. Not dramatically, not in one clean redemptive arc the way Hollywood would write it. Messily, slowly, with setbacks that would have broken someone with less stubbornness, or perhaps someone with more to fall back on. He became a basketball coach. Not an NBA assistant. Not a college program. A high school basketball coach in South Florida, working with teenagers who reminded him of himself at that age. Talented kids from difficult backgrounds being told that the ball was their only way out. He understood that assignment better than anyone. For a few years, it worked. He was good at it. The kids responded to him. He knew what they needed to hear because he had needed to hear it himself, decades earlier, and nobody had said it. But in 2013, a DUI conviction cost him that job. The school was a Jewish day school in South Florida. The conviction disqualified him from working there. And just like that, the one thing he had rebuilt, the one role that gave his post-basketball life structure and purpose, was gone. Another punch. What happened next is important, because it's the part of Kenny Anderson's story that separates it from a simple tragedy. He didn't disappear. He didn't retreat into the kind of permanent obscurity that swallows many athletes after the money runs out and the cameras move on. He started talking. In 2013, the same year the DUI cost him his coaching job, the same year he was arguably at his lowest since the 2005 bankruptcy, Kenny Anderson publicly revealed for the first time that he had been sexually abused as a child. Think about what that took. He was 42 years old. He had spent 3 decades performing the role of a confident, larger-than-life basketball star. The entire architecture of his public identity, Mr. Chibbs, the playground legend, the second overall pick, the all-star, was built on the image of a man who had everything under control. And he stood up and said, "Something happened to me when I was a child, and I have been carrying it ever since." He said he did it for the kids, the young players he had been coaching, the ones he saw carrying their own invisible weights, the ones who had been told that strength meant silence. "I wanted to help some of these kids that's dealing with trauma, molestation, and abuse," he said. He also said something quietly devastating about his mother. "If my mother were still living, I don't know if I would have done it and came out." Joan Anderson had been gone for 8 years by then. And somehow, her absence had made the truth possible. The person he had most wanted to protect from that knowledge was no longer there to be protected. Grief, in its strange way, had unlocked something. In 2017, the documentary Mr. Chibbs was released. Directed by Jill Campbell, the film followed Kenny Anderson at 46, a man in the middle of a midlife crisis, dealing with drinking, trying to find steady work, returning to Lefrak City and Archbishop Malloy, walking through the places that made him. It was not a triumphant film. It was not a redemption story with a neat bow on it. It was a portrait of a man trying, in real time, to figure out who he was without the thing that had defined him since he was 12 years old. One of the most revealing moments in the film is when Kenny finally explains the title. Chibs, his baby nickname. The name his mother gave him. Mr. Chibs, the version his mother invoked when he forgot himself. When the attention got too big and the ego got too loud, and the boy from Lefrak City started believing his own mythology. For his entire career, the world had called him Mr. Chibs, adoringly, as a celebration of greatness, of playground legend, of New York City basketball royalty. But Kenny Anderson knew what it actually meant. It meant, you are getting too big for who you really are. The documentary was his way of finally answering his mother's warning, of separating the legend from the man, of saying, clearly and publicly, I am not Mr. Chibs. I am Kenny Anderson. And Kenny Anderson has been through things that Mr. Chibs was never allowed to acknowledge. The film earned a Village Voice Critics pick. It traveled to festivals. People who watched it didn't see a broke athlete. They saw a human being doing the hardest work there is, the work of becoming honest about your own life. In 2018, Kenny Anderson was named head coach of the men's basketball program at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Fisk is a historically black university, small, underfunded relative to major programs, not the kind of platform that generates ESPN coverage or six-figure coaching salaries. But it is exactly the kind of place where a man who has been through what Kenny Anderson has been through can do meaningful work. He is coaching young men, teaching them basketball, yes, but more than that, teaching them what nobody taught him. That identity cannot be entirely athletic. That money requires education, not just accumulation. That the things you carry in silence will eventually find a way out, one way or another, and it is better to choose how they emerge than to let them choose for you. His net worth today is estimated at $800,000. That number, compared to $63 million, might look like failure. It isn't. It is what remains after a man has paid every debt, financial and otherwise, that life handed him. And it is entirely, unambiguously, his. So what is the real story of Kenny Anderson? It isn't the cars. It isn't the child support. It isn't the bankruptcy filing or the DUIs or the 9 teams in 14 years. Those are symptoms, visible damage on the surface of something that runs much deeper. The real story starts in Lefrak City, Queens, when a 12-year-old boy was identified as valuable not as a person, but as an athletic asset, and an entire industry organized itself around extracting that value as efficiently as possible. The scouts came in 6th grade. The newspapers came at 14. The college recruiters came with scholarships and promises. The NBA came with a 2nd overall pick and a contract and a franchise that needed saving. And at every single stage, the system got exactly what it needed from Kenny Anderson. Nobody asked what Kenny Anderson needed in return. Not financial education. Not psychological support. Not a single structured conversation about what happens when the career ends, when the salary stops, when the arena empties and the phone gets quiet, and you're left alone with the question you were never given space to answer. Who are you when you're not playing? Kenny Anderson is not unique in this failure. That's the part that should disturb you most. According to a Sports Illustrated study, an estimated 60% of NBA players face significant financial distress within 5 years of retirement. 60%. In a league where the average salary has climbed into the millions. That is not a coincidence. That is not a character flaw shared by the majority of professional athletes. That is a systemic pattern, the predictable outcome of an industry that identifies talented young people, often from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, accelerates them into enormous wealth before they have the tools to manage it, surrounds them with financial relationships that serve everyone except the athlete, and then releases them into retirement with no transition infrastructure whatsoever. Kenny Anderson went through it. Allen Iverson went through it. Antoine Walker went through it. Scottie Pippen went through it. The names change. The collapse follows the same architecture every single time. The system has never been designed to protect the player. It has always been designed to protect a product. There is one more thing worth saying about Kenny Anderson specifically. He did something that most people in his situation never do. He told the truth. Not just about the bankruptcy, or the cars, or the failed marriages. The real truth. The truth about what happened to him as a child in Lefrak City. The truth about what he had been carrying for 3 decades under every contract and every all-star appearance, and every performance of invincibility that the role of Mr. Chibbs required. He told that truth not to generate sympathy, not to excuse the financial decisions or the personal ones. He told it because he had spent years coaching young people and recognized in them the same silence he had once maintained, the silence of a child who was told, in 1,000 implicit ways, that their only value was athletic. Basketball is easy, he said. Life is hard. He wasn't being self-deprecating. He was being precise. Basketball had always been easy for Kenny Anderson. From the courts of Lefrak City to the Georgia Tech Final Four to the 1994 All-Star Game, the basketball came naturally, reliably, completely. It was the one place where he always knew who he was and what he was supposed to do. Life, the part outside the lines, the part with money and relationships and trauma and identity and the grinding work of becoming a whole person, that was always the harder game. And nobody ever coached him for that one. Today, Kenny Anderson is 54 years old. He is in Nashville. He is coaching. He is, by every account, present in a way that the career years didn't always allow, present for his children, present for his players, present for himself. The boy from Lefrak City that the whole system consumed is still here, older, quieter, more honest than he was ever permitted to be when the arenas were full and the contracts were large and everyone needed him to be Mr. Chibbs. His mother gave him that name as a warning. It took him most of his life to fully understand it. Don't get too big for who you really are. Remember where you came from. Remember that the ball is not the whole of you. He remembers now. And maybe that more than any contract, more than any all-star selection, more than any number with a $sign in front of it is what it finally means to win. If this story resonated with you, share it. Not as a cautionary tale about money. Share it as a conversation about what we owe the young people we decide are talented. About what the system takes and what it never gives back. And about what it means to rebuild a life from something more durable than a basketball.